So the question that I saw was off the back of the Airbnb topics that we discussed. Now, at that time, there was a whole conversation around whether body corporates can restrict or restrain an owner of a sectional scheme or a unit from from renting on a short-term basis. Now, this obviously was centered around the Airbnb model, where somebody would buy a unit in a complex and they would try Airbnb it out. And you obviously find this very, very popular in like your Durban and Mhlanga areas, where that's what you actually do. A lot of the times it's really beautiful buildings with views, and you try Airbnb them out. So a lot of the times you'd actually buy the property with this intention. So our viewer saw this video, but she asked the question, but it kind of throws a curveball because it's different. So now we're not complaining about body corporates being restrictive or obstructive. We're now asking the question on whether landlords can do this. And from the stance of the question, it was, if a landlord that owns the building rents it out to me and I do short-term Airbnb, or I'd like to do short-term Airbnb. Unfortunately, the question wasn't specific on whether they had been doing it or they were just planning on doing it. But the building also has a hotel as a tenant. And this hotel is obviously running the business of a hotel. And basically the question was, is there a workaround that kind of allows this person, this client, or this viewer to run an Airbnb or short-term letting if the landlord says that they can't, simply because the hotel is putting pressure on the landlord or the hotel is putting pressure on the tenant? So this is such a loaded question because there's different aspects that we need to look at here. For starters, you're looking at your leasing model and whether a person is actually allowed to sublet, because that's what you'd be doing. If you don't own the property and you're letting it from a landlord and now you want to sublet it to somebody else and it's a residential property, we start asking the question now of whether you as a tenant can actually sublet, whether the landlord allows this to take place, which typically is not the case. Most lease agreements would say it would restrict who occupies the property, let alone like actually sublet it out. And what we tend to find is that people that want to enter into rent-to-rent agreements, and that's what we call it, is where you rent from a landlord in order to rent to somebody else, especially with the Airbnb model where you might not have the funding to buy the property. Typically in those instances, you want to make sure that your contract is airtight, because a lot of money goes behind investing in Airbnb. There's a lot of furnishings, a lot of things particular to that area. So the last thing you'd want is to invest so much in the property and then all of a sudden the landlord terminates or says you're in breach or something happens, tries to get out of it because he's selling the property. So this is an investment. It's a business transaction. So you want to make sure that the contract is right. So that's the first thing that we need to ask is, what does the lease say? Because if the landlord allows for it in the lease because you negotiated with it prior, then there's nothing he can do now that's going to stop you from doing it. So you've got rights set in stone. Even if he's got a different agreement with the hotel that restricts it, your rights are still in place. So that's the first thing that we need to look at from a contractual perspective. Now, what's very interesting is from a commercial perspective, and there's recent case law on this regarding restrictive terms when it comes to commercial lease agreements, especially in shopping centers with exclusivity, where anchor tenants were using their bargaining power to restrict what type of tenant the landlord could actually get into the shopping center. And this to me sounds very similar to this, because at the end of the day, the Airbnb is, for all intents and purposes, a business. SARS seems to consider it as a business insofar as VAT is concerned, and so does, and the hotel is a business. So, I mean, again, we don't know what the lease looks like, but if this is actually with commercial intent, we have to ask the question on fairness and competitive behavior, whether anchor tenant is actually allowed to restrict other people from competing with it. And the court found that it's not fair. It's not in the spirit of competitive behavior, and that those sort of provisions were, if I recall correctly, it was contra bono mores. So it's just interesting. So to answer the question twofold, the lease says a lot, yes, but there is an element of fairness when it comes to restrictive trade practices. But that is obviously presumed on whether your lease is actually a residential lease or not. Because if it was intended to be a residential lease, then you can't really force the landlord to make it a rent to rent, so you can run your business from there. But yeah, I think that kind of covers it.
I agree with you 100%. Actually, I wanted to bring in the commercial lease agreement aspect, which you did perfectly. Anyway, I wanted to mention that on commercial properties, we see it often. A restrictive, I once had a case, I think it must have been about 6 years ago, while vaping wasn't a big thing yet, and there were limited vaping situations, and I won't mention the chain's name, but there was a very big chain that sold Twist. Remember when Twist was like one of the first e-cigarette vaping devices? And this chain said they are going to pull out of this center and out of every center that this landlord owns, unless they, I think Evolution Vape was the company that just had like a little pop-up stand. And they said they're going to pull their shops from this landlord's malls, and it's a very big chain, unless they remove that pop-up shop. And it was a pretty big fight. And essentially our argument was on behalf of the landlord, but this is anti-competitive behavior. You can't, as this big, massive chain, come in on a smaller, and at that time, Evolution Vape was still a very small upcoming thing. I mean, currently you see Evolution Vape shops in pretty much every mall, and they're pretty big shops, and they're clearly performing very well. So well done, Evolution Vape. I'm very impressed with what you guys are doing, but on the way they're building their business. I don't like vaping, but so that's a very that was a very interesting thing, and I know this happens, and especially if this is a bigger hotel group, I suppose they can easily intimidate a landlord to feel, oh my goodness, I have to please these guys because they might just move their business somewhere else. And the truth is, luckily, we do have this case law. So that's what I wanted to mention. But so I think we've covered that one completely. The only other comment that I wanted to make is, what if you buy a property? Let's stick. It seems like tonight's theme is Airbnb. This is not what happened. So what I wanted to mention is, if you buy a property with the intention to, look at me now framing my own question. If you buy a property with the sole intention to use it as an Airbnb, what happens if prior to transfer, the body corporate makes a decision, brings out a conduct rule that says you are not allowed to Airbnb in this place? Now, I know you and I've had these conversations, and we've had so many questions on this, but I think it's such an important one, because we've had that actually a property in Cape Town. It must have been then like Clifton or Constantia or one of those places, where our client bought this investment property for 21 million rand. It's a complex with only 6 properties at the complex, obviously residential properties. And our client bought that property with the exclusive intention of Airbnb it out. And unfortunately for our client, what happened is he bought the property transferred. Then there was a special general meeting, which he did not attend. They changed the conduct rules. So they called the SGM in terms of the management rules. They've done it correctly. Our client did not attend. and the majority owners, and it is only 6. So look at me now, coming back to my binge watching Survivor. So when you sit with 6, you need an alliance of
Sure.
more than 3. I know these things now. I'm clever. I learned so much from Survivor. So unfortunately, they didn't have. I think his vote would actually have been the vote that swings the thing, and the rules were
He wasn't
adopted,
there.
and
Yeah.
he wasted 21 million rand. Now, I've bought stuff in my life sometimes that I think, this is not actually ideal, but it's not easily 21 million rand that you like,
Sure.
oh, giffy, now what? And now you have to sell, and currently, especially in Cape Town, in that market, a 21 million rand property isn't going to sell that well. And so that's very sad. And unfortunately, I think a lot of owners in sectional title complexes doesn't know that if something is tabled, you can actually really put up a proper fight, because that's the time to do it when the issue is raised and we're talking about the conduct rules. Come in and say why it is a problem, why do you want to do this, why it wouldn't be a security risk, which steps would you take as the owner to protect the other owners, what would you do to ensure that these people aren't loud and rowdy and stuff, what will you do to achieve that? And maybe you can swing a vote. Have you ever seen the other way around? What I mean is, have you ever had a client who bought into a complex where they weren't allowed to Airbnb and were successful in approaching the body corporate and changing the rule to allow it? Have you ever had that?
I'll be honest, it's never happened, because I think most of the guys go in with the intention, so they feel it might be a bit of a risk if it's not already allowed. But I mean, I can imagine maybe even a current owner that's been living there for 20 years suddenly wants to move to another city and goes, oh, what do I do with this property? Let me Airbnb it. Wait, it's not allowed? Let me push for a resolution to allow it. So I can see it happening. It's definitely a practical example.
Would you say you can approach a court to compel a body corporate to allow it?
I don't think so. So if you look at that recent case that we discussed the last time, that speaks of the democracy within a body corporate, as it were, and the fact that you sign in and you give up certain rights, and you almost govern almost like it is a government, right? And it's governed in terms of rules, and you abide by these rules. And if the body corporate is designed to, for example, focus on lifestyle and relaxation and, that sort of thing, like it's got a certain purpose behind it. The court's attitude was each case needs to be considered under its own circumstance. So that's the first thing. And I said it the last time. The case does not say that under all circumstances, people can say no to short-term letting in the body corporate. But the court did consider what the scheme was about, what the intention was, why the owners were in the scheme to begin with. And if a lot of the owners were there because they wanted peace, quiet, they don't want strangers, they wanted a small little community, the court would actually consider that as a reason why the majority voted against Airbnb, because there's an actual purpose, a justifiable purpose, as it were, versus like, for example, if this thing was built for holidays, one could very easily argue that, sure, the only reason you'd buy this thing is to put people in it during the holiday. But I don't think you'd be able to compel. I think you may be able to maybe turn a vote that goes against you. But yeah, it's a difficult one. I think if it doesn't exist, you probably wouldn't be able to force it because it's not necessarily, yeah, I don't know, it's strange. It is prohibitive. So maybe you could still argue that there's no rationale behind it. And you could maybe set aside that rule if it does exist. I don't think you need to compel the body corporate to say yes, but you might be able to overturn a decision of no, if that makes sense.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree with you 100%. I wonder, I'm really desperate. I can't believe we don't have more case law yet around that, because my personal feeling, and I've said this on quite a few occasions and quite publicly, I think it's quite silly for a body corporate to, as a result of fear, make a fear-driven decision not to allow Airbnb, because I mean, I've had a levy collection department in SSLR for quite some time. And every time you see the body corporates that suffer, one of the things that pull a body corporate out of a levy crisis is allowing Airbnb, because your Airbnb investors are the guys who pay their levies pretty properly.
Absolutely. No, absolutely.
So I do not understand. I do understand a fear decision. I must say personally, I think it was very unfortunate, because unfortunately, this pushing the rule of not allowing Airbnb does come from managing agents and attorneys more than from the owner occupant.
Absolutely.
So that's very unfortunate.
And look, and what would actually be quite nice, I suppose, if we had the time, it would be really great to actually put together a protocol that you could take to body corporates, because it is right. It's misinformation. It's fear. We deal with Airbnb all the time, and we deal with normal leases. So for me, I would much rather like have a tenant that Airbnbs, because I know the strict requirements, the rating system, the vetting beforehand, all of this that actually gets put in place, versus a tenant where sometimes the vetting's not that great because it's subjective. And once the guy stays there for long periods of time, he starts taking things for granted. He starts fighting with the neighbors. I mean, people get on each other's nerves one way or another. A guy could be the most unfriendliest guy, but he goes Airbnbs for one night and gets out. The likeness of him getting to a fight versus a long-term tenant, it's exactly that. So I actually find the Airbnb is a great way of limiting risk, but the problem isn't with Airbnb, it's short-term letting. And we're using Airbnb as a type of a verb. You go, I'm going to Airbnb it out. But Airbnb is a specific platform with specific rules, with super hosts and vetting processes, but short-term letting's not. I mean, there's places that rent rooms for an hour a day. You understand that's short-term letting too.
Yes.
And there you want to be careful.
But that's usually not for occupation. You don't really occupy for a long time. It's not accommodation per se, is it?
Unless you say, but you get the point. But that's exactly it. And that's what people are like, who's being let in? If there's a protocol saying, what if you adopt this into the rules and it favors everyone? And it's a set protocol that you can just kind of like run through CSOS. They go, well, it's reasonable. And you actually go into body corporates and say, plug this in, plug this in, plug this in.
That's very clever, because I think what a lot of people also don't know is, in the context of a short-term rental, specifically Airbnb, those kind of short-term holiday or business stays, the Prevention of Illegal Evictions Act will not apply when you do that eviction. And the reason for that is obviously because somebody by definition has another place to stay. And you record that on the app and everywhere. Everybody knows what your actual address is. So when we need to do that eviction, it's a commercial eviction, 4 to 6 weeks done. And I wonder if body corporates consider that in making their decisions, and even investors. That might think, but it's risky to Airbnb, where in fact, I mean, you cut out the Prevention of Illegal Evictions Act and your eviction software. I'm personally a very big Airbnber. When I travel, I hate staying in hotels. It grosses me out on a whole new level. I love an Airbnb. It feels like I'm at home, somebody else's home, but at least it feels like I'm at home. And it's pleasant and nice. And I must say, I've never been in an Airbnb where I feel like, if I was a different person, this could go, belly up. It's not like, but maybe I'm just a good occupant. So I thought, let me throw in the pie thing on Airbnb.
No, look, it makes a lot of sense. Maybe it's a conversation we should also have off air, because I think there's a lot of value we could probably add if we did do something like that and distribute to the industry. So any viewers that would be interested, I suppose the problem is it comes down to time and funding, because a lot of the stuff, and this is why I find there isn't case law on this, is because you get approached by a single Airbnb owner complaining that according to the rules, their levies are doubled. or not levies, sorry, their penalties are doubled if something goes wrong. And you're like, okay, great, we can fight it by doing A, B, and C. But sometimes they go, well, you know, it's cheaper to pay the penalty sometimes than it is to pay an attorney to go fight it. So what's the point? And then to try and get all these people together is a mission in itself. So it would actually be interesting to get a group of people that goes, we are Airbnb enthusiasts. We would be willing to actually put retainers together, you know, like a little association that goes out and actually does things like this, you know, creates protocols, you know, takes case law on. So it would actually be nice. So we should maybe have the conversation. If there's any viewers that would actually be interested in this, like, guys, come, let's do it. Like, we can't start it for you. We can only actually pull the trigger. Like, we need the people to come to us and say, come, do it. So like, get your friends, get your family, get everyone together, and let's have that conversation. Let's, call a meeting and discuss this.
I like that. I think we can. And I think most Airbnb hosts feel that they are so alone when it comes to the property industry. They're sort of there in their own little corner. But let's pull them in. Talk to us.